welcome to the first ever, the inaugural Colorado Politicking Live edition. I'm here with Colorado Politics senior writer Joey Bunch and Colorado Politics chief legislative reporter and one of my favorite people in the world after spending a heck of a lot of time with her this last legislative session, Marianne Goodland. I can actually say this in person, lady and gentlemen, how are we doing?
Glad to be here.
Glad it's over.
So, it is over, and I want to start there, Marianne. What did you make of the session as the savvy veteran of the bunch?
We saw a lot of very bold, progressive ideas that Democrats ran on in the 2020 election, and you saw the fruition of that. Everything from transportation to gun bills to another paid leave funding bill. They did exactly what they said they were going to do, and that made for some very interesting times, particularly the House, where Republicans did everything they could to slow down that agenda. Senate Republicans used those slowdowns to negotiate and make changes on some of those bills because they didn't. I think the Senate Democrats didn't want to see the same things happening. But you also saw a session that was extremely mentally stressful, in part because of some of the behaviors that you saw coming from some of the lawmakers. And you saw that very well typified in the House, where the attempt to maintain decorum was very much hit or miss.
Now, we can definitely go into a little bit more of those things, and probably more aptly, you can check out the coverage that Marianne, Joey, and I did on coloradopolitics.com. We have stories on all the major bills that came through, as well as some of those issues of decorum. But let's kind of zoom out and go a little bit more big picture. So this is the third consecutive legislative session with a trifecta of Democrat control under the Gold Dome. So governor is Democrat, Senate's controlled by Democrats, House is controlled by Democrats. How did that advantage manifest itself in 2021?
That bold agenda that Democrats had was definitely a manifestation of 2021. In an election year, you don't see these kinds of legislations because people are afraid that these things are going to get used against them in the election. So this year, it was no holds barred. Anything Democrats wanted to do, for the most part, they did accomplish exactly what they wanted to. I don't think you're going to see the same sort of ideas coming forward in the 2022 session, even for some of the things that they didn't get accomplished, simply because it will be an election year. The other thing that you saw was what I would call a lot of arrogance by Democrats. They don't need Republican votes, and they made that very clear in way too many situations.
And to jump in on that, Marianne, I'll add a little bit of context and a little bit of reporting behind this. I think we're still seeing Republicans find their feet as the opposition party, and looking particularly at the House GOP, where they're at a 17-seat disadvantage. If you're at a 17-seat disadvantage, you're fighting uphill. But some of the divisions we saw within that caucus, it made it fighting uphill with one hand tied behind your back.
Absolutely.
And to a degree, I think we saw a bit of a resolution of that on that last day, where House Republicans caucused. There was, I guess, what you could call a potential mutiny against Hugh McKean, and he came out of that with 2/3 of support of his own caucus. Now, the optics of that said mutiny don't look good for Republicans. They look like they're fighting amongst themselves. But I think one thing that is kind of interesting on this is that, remember, Hugh McKean was only recently elected as a leader, and when he was elected, it took 2 ballots to get there. In the first ballot, he only got 9 votes. He got 16 votes in support after the session, so he's considerably expanded his influence within that caucus. But again, he's still fighting uphill, and there are still 8 members of that caucus that are against his priorities. But that could, of course, change because we do have elections coming up, don't we, Joey?
We sure do. You know, Marianne said that this year was a manifestation of 2020. Well, it's also a manifestation of 2022 because, you know, a lot of things that the Democrats did this year, they had to do this year. And there was no opportunity to put it off to next year, because next year people are going to be looking at their new districts after redistricting. And because of Amendment Y and Z, these districts are going to be competitive. Some of those moderate votes will be harder to get next year when they're looking at a district that has changed a whole lot. So I think that they had to pass this progressive Christmas tree, if you want to call it that. And, you know, Democrats, I think they had a great session because they checked off all the boxes on the progressive wish list. But I think half of Colorado would say they had a horrible session. You know, John Caldera said it was the worst session of, that he could remember in his 30 years of doing this as far as individual freedoms go. You know, they went around the voters on taxes. They passed a lot of taxes increases that would never pass on the ballot. So, you know, they're counting on doing all the dirty work this year, or things that could hurt them with moderates. And then next year, I think we'll see a, you know, a lot calmer situation. But to, you know, at the State House, we have two things going on. We have politics and we have governing, and sometimes one is a distraction from the other. And I think this year that you could say that, you know, the governing and the things that they were doing with stimulants was distracting away from the politics. And next year, the politics will distract from the governing.
Well, let's wrap up this year first, and I want to play a little game with you two. Let's call it up and down. Who's up, who's down, whose stock is up, whose stock is down. Joey, let's start with you. In reviewing this legislative session, who do you think did really well? Who's rising?
Well, you know, I hate to always pick Leslie Harrod, but I'm going to pick her again. I mean, every year, you know, she seems like she's, you know, at the center of the session, and again this year, both good and bad. Her name was on 37 different bills, but at the same time, she had conflicts with other Democrats. In the final last few days, I understand she had an awkward meeting with Alec Garnett about a bill that she might have been holding up. So, you know, it's just hard. If you want to say who's the person who made a name for themselves or built on the name that they have, it's Leslie.
Marianne, over to you. Who's up?
Mark Catlin, I say, has really come to the forefront in leadership, not only within his caucus, but within the House in general. He is a Republican, and he's from Montrose. And Alec Garnett took one of the most unusual steps I've ever seen a lawmaker take, or a leader take. He made Mark the vice chair of the House Agriculture Committee. It's unheard of. Nobody can ever remember somebody from the opposite party being put in charge or put in a leadership role in a committee. And we got to see his leadership style on a bill that in one of the hearings in May, on a bill that was actually sponsored by the House Majority Leader. And he managed the committee extremely well. The bill did exactly what one anticipated. But this is such this was really a groundbreaking kind of moment in the House. And I think we can expect to see Mark Catlin take an even greater leadership role in the future.
And I'll close out. I don't think we can talk about whose stock is up without talking about Senator Faith Winter, who's a Democrat from Westminster. Now, I was reviewing some of her work kind of in the aftermath in the closing days. She had 30 bills that cleared the legislature and landed on the governor's desk. And we're talking about some of the major pieces of legislation this session. We're talking about the $5.4 billion stimulus package. She was a co-prime on that. Expanding ranked choice voting in municipalities. She was a co-prime on that. And even some kind of smaller measures. She had something, for instance, that gave a grant program for free menstrual products in schools. She did have some losses mixed in, we'll say that. The Power Act, which was a workplace discrimination and anti-harassment bill, cleared the Senate, but died a pretty slow death in the House. It lost 9-2 in the House Judiciary Committee. And Governor Jared Polis squashed her big greenhouse gas emissions bill, although even on that front, she ended up winning in a way because she took elements from that and ended up moving it into another bill, the last bill that the House heard of the session. Made Republicans crazy. They cried abusive process, but she did manage to get it through, and in the end, it's going to be on the governor's desk. So that's up from all three of us. Let's talk about down. What was down this session, Marianne?
Stakeholding. And this is an interesting process between the House and Senate. Over the last couple of sessions in the House, it's been something that the Speaker of the House has really insisted on, at least with the members of their caucus, is that you have to sit down with everyone who's impacted by your bill, including people who are going to oppose it, but you've got to have those conversations. That doesn't seem to be the rule of thumb in the Senate. And so you've got a couple of people who this year rammed bills through without talking to the people that it impacted the most. And I'm going to pick on Jessie Danielson, who's a senator from Wheat Ridge and a Democrat. She had a farm workers bill. Didn't talk to anybody from the ag industry, any of the ag industry leaders, before she started on that bill. She did a bill on Indian mascots, never talked to a single school. There's 24 schools in this state who have Indian mascots. Some are really, really offensive. She didn't talk to any of the people from those schools before she started on that bill. We also had the so-called public option bill that is no longer a public option. The sponsors of that bill didn't bring in the insurance companies, which are the ones who are going to be responsible for much of the implementation of this, until sometime early this year. This bill has been in the works for 2 years. So we heard a lot of complaints about a lack of communication, a lack of stakeholding, and pretty much it was with the Democrats who were the ones that they were calling out.
You know, Marianne, you raised a lot of good points there. Yeah, and the last 2 weeks of the session were absolutely insane. They always are. But, you know, bills were being rewritten. Amendments were being thrown around like, you know, Mardi Gras candy. Yeah, I believe what the political pundit Ferris Bueller said. You know, the session moves pretty fast. If you don't slow down every now and then, you might miss it.
Let's close out by looking a little bit more big picture and a little bit further down the road. After this legislative session, after all this stuff we just spent a lot of time talking about, where do we go from here?
I think redistricting is going to be the watchword for the next year and the next 6 months at least. And when we get to see those maps, I think we'll have a much better picture of what kinds of legislation even that you're going to see in the 2022 session, because you're going to have lawmakers not wanting to risk their seats. And as the point that was made earlier about moderation, I think you're going to see a lot of moderation. Of course, you also have the 2022 election coming up, and we'll see just who's willing to take risks. I don't think you're going to see as much risk taking as you surely did in this session.
Well, I think it just depends on what Republicans can do to keep the facts alive that Democrats spent a lot of money this year. They did a lot on the environment. They did a lot on electric vehicles. Yes, they passed a major transportation bill, but it was a bit of a Trojan horse. You know, only a fraction of that money is going to wind up in what people generally think of transportation is. You know, a lot of it's going to go to transit. It's going to go to electric vehicles. It's going to go to climate change initiatives. And I don't think that would pass. You know, we had 3 votes on funding transportation in 2 years, and all of them failed. That was an end run on the voters, but it's a worthy need. So I think that what has to happen for Republicans to make I look for Republicans to lose ground next year after this session. Just after a few minutes ago, I said Democrats didn't do themselves any favor. You know, Democrats could implode if Republicans would stop imploding bigger and drawing the attention away. So I look for more fireworks but less substance, because it's an election year and that's what we do.
Well, thank you to 2 of the absolute best in the business for joining us on Thursdays throughout this legislative session to really wrap up everything that's been going on. If you have any interest at all in any of the bills we talked about, any of the political happenings, you can almost surely find a story about it at coloradopolitics.com. Until next week and until next legislative session, I'm Pat Poblete. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you have enjoyed what you've seen.